Hi again. The following part will be held in English. That's why I'm sorry, because I know that most of you are Turkish, but anyhow. First of all, I'd like to inform you about the next program coming up. After this one, we will have İşte benim Zeki Müren, and the moderator will be the Dean of the faculty, Mr. Peyami Çelikcan. And then our Professor Muzaffer Şenel will present the third one, which is Veda Busesi. And now, the person I'm going to leave the floor next for his speech, among the worldwide professors or researchers, is the most prominent one working on the field. Mr. Martin Stokes is King Edward Professor at the King's College in London, UK. He has special research interests in ethnomusicology and anthropology, as well as Middle Eastern popular music. Dr. Stokes obtained his PhD from the University of Oxford in 1989. He currently studies music and music theory with a particular emphasis on the contemporary Middle East. Among all his achievements, he also filled the role of Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Chicago. We are very glad to have this big man in Şehir. Welcome one more time. And now, Mr. Stokes, please give the honor to learn more from you.
Thank you very much for this very warm and kind welcome. I'm grateful to be speaking in English, but I gather that actually this is an English language speaking university, so I was actually positively encouraged to speak in English. I hope the speed and the way in which I speak English is comprehensible. I'd like to thank Muzaffer Şener. I'd like to thank everybody associated with the modern Türkiye Çalışmaları Merkezi ve Sosyoloji Bölümü for supporting and organizing this wonderful gathering. I'd like to thank Fatih and Ebra for all of their work organizing everything so beautifully and so well. As far as language is concerned, I think I'm going to speak for 40 minutes or so, and then we can have a conversation. I think it's going to be fine for the conversation to be half in Turkish and half in English, which is to say, if you want to ask your questions in Turkish, I can understand, or some process of translation will make this work. I think it's not well known in Turkey, is what I think of as the Swiss principle here, which you speak in your first language and you speak in your first language and you listen in your second language. So maybe that can be the way we organize ourselves over the hour. I'm really delighted to be here. Actually, it's always nice to be talking about and thinking about our topic of conversation today, Zeki Müren. I consider myself to be an amateur here amongst the professionals, so I hope you will excuse me and what I don't know, and consider me, as I consider myself, as somebody who has very much to learn about Zeki Müren. I'd also just like to say a word of thank you just to everybody, really, for the very warm welcome and the very warm reception of a book that I wrote that was translated recently into Turkish as Aşk Cumhuriyeti. I'm very glad that that book has had such a warm reception here, and that its many mistakes and errors have been so gently tolerated. Yes, I am the King Edward Professor of Music at King's College London. We are a nation of potato eaters, and the most famous kind of potato is called a King Edward potato. So I am also known in London as the King Edward potato of musicology. So here is a potatoes speech. Zeki Müren is a topic of sociology, of course. He's a case study in the sociology of media, identity, and voice. Habitually, in this country and elsewhere, Zeki Müren is approached as a sociological issue, a sociological problem, a sociological case study. I'm a musician, as well as being a musicologist. And I would like to keep reminding people that Zeki Müren is not only a sociological issue and a sociological problem, but he's a musical issue, a musical problem, a musical case study as well. What he means to music, what he means to Turkish music, what he might mean to Turkish musicologists, is, I think, also something we need to keep remembering. To put it another way, I'm rather against, I hope this won't sound ungracious in the context of this environment, but I'm rather against the idea that the only interesting thing about Zeki Müren is what he stands for sociologically. So I think it's nice also that you've invited myself and others who approach Zeki Müren from the point of view of people interested in music. I wanted to start off my talk by recalling Freud's words in his famous and rather important and rather complicated essay called From Mourning to Melancholy. Freud said that when somebody dies, and we're going through the process of mourning, and we're going through the process of mourning, he points out that we know who we have lost, but we don't necessarily know what we have lost in that person. We know who we have lost, but we don't know what we have lost in that person. This he describes as the melancholic condition. We have lost somebody, we feel the pain of that loss very deeply, but what it is that we have lost in that person is still unclear to us. We have to search for it, and we may never know what it is we have lost. The death of a crooner, the death of a vocal artist, the death of a national vocal artist, I think is interesting in this context. Let us think for a moment about the deaths of, let me just call them the global crooners. The word crooner, you know, the microphone-based popular music singer of the mid-years of the 20th century. Abdel Halim Hafez in Egypt, the voice of Egypt. Carlos Gardel, the great tango singer, famous in Hollywood, the voice of Argentina. Amalia Rodriguez, the voice of fado, the genre fado in Portugal, the voice of Portugal, as many would call her. Frank Sinatra, of course, a very particular kind of Americanness. And then, of course, our very own Zeki Müren. What interests me is that when these people die, a nation that maybe has not been very interested in them whilst they're alive becomes very interested in them at their death. The state lays on its official mourning. The state underlines the death of these people. The state says somebody important has died, somebody important to us has died. A nation mourns in these situations, just as Turkey mourned at the death of Zeki Müren in 1996. But Freud's question hangs in the air here. What has been lost? We know who has been lost, but we don't yet know what has been lost. In Zeki Müren's case, there are many candidates for an answer to this question of what has been lost, or which part of the nation has been lost, or indeed which nation has been lost with the passing of Zeki Müren. A high cultural Turkey, the Turkey of classical music, the Turkey of classical Ottoman culture. a liberal Turkey, perhaps, a cosmopolitan Turkey, the Turkey of the Menderes era of kind of Las Vegas accented cosmopolitanism, a queer or a dissident Turkey, a Turkey of minorities and the margins, a Sufi Turkey, perhaps, or a tradition of Turkish Sufism of a popular kind, a Turkey of authentic popular culture, a Turkey of the nightclubs and the casinos and the popular classes, a civil Turkey, a citizenly Turkey, perhaps. And of course, I want to come back to this question of Zeki Müren as an icon of citizenship and civility towards the end of my talk. But it seems to me that when Zeki Müren died, and the question arises as to what has been lost with this person, all of these visions of the nation, all of these perspectives on the nation, all of these ways of imagining the nation are plausible candidates for what has been lost. The point that I want to make here and keep on stressing is that we don't know what has been lost, but the death of a person pushes a process of trying to identify the nature of that loss, to identify the nature of that loss. And what's been interesting me in the other things that I'm interested in and that I work on is that I think the Zeki Müren case is rather similar in some ways to the loss of other national voices at around about the same time. Gardel, Rodriguez, Abdel Halim Hafez, one could name many people in rather similar kinds of political environments in many other parts of the world. One of the things that certainly has been lost, and clearly lost, is a voice. A voice has been lost. A distinctly Turkish voice has been lost. I think in the other situations that spring to mind, the calling these voices the voice of their nation, Abdel Halim Hafez, the voice of Egypt, Amalia Rodriguez, the voice of Portugal, Carlos Gardel, the voice of Argentina. This was very much underlined. Incidentally, Carlos Gardel was not from Argentina at all. He was from Uruguay, but he was remembered as the voice of Argentina. Now, Zeki Müren as the voice of Turkey, maybe this wasn't so explicit in the discourse that surrounded him after his death, but nonetheless, a distinctly national voice was considered to have been lost when he passed away, when he died. I want to keep on asking Freud's question here. Which voice? Okay, we think of Zeki Müren's voice as being one voice, a singular voice, but of course it was many voices. Zeki Müren's voice was highly multiple. Are we talking about the young voice? The voice of those wonderful early radio recordings released by Kalan a few years back? Or are we talking about the older Zeki Müren voice? An old voice, an ill voice, a sick voice, a voice that was marked by his physical afflictions and illnesses? Are we talking about the classical music Zeki Müren voice or the arabesque Zeki Müren voice? Rather different. Are we talking about we heard about this in the last session, the radio voice or the nightclub voice or the recording studio voice or the film voice? I think all different kinds of Zeki Müren voices. Are we talking about the spoken voice or the sung voice? Because there are connections, but the spoken voice was a very particular kind of voice, was it not, in this country? The sung voice, a rather separate and a different thing. Already, we've got a question here. If we're telling ourselves that a voice has been lost, which voice are we talking about? Even if one is to do the typical musicians or musicologists thing and just look at a particular song. Within that song, there are many different voices. Now, we were talking with Sheda over lunch about what a postmodern analysis of song might actually be. Now, here it seems to me is a very obvious kind of question. Instead of looking at a song as something that speaks with one voice, if we were to look at it and think about it as something that is speaking with many voices and multiple voices, we might call this a characteristic of melodrama in Zeki Müren's voice. I conducted a kind of analysis along these lines of a rather interesting song, or a song that interests me, Melancholic Condition. Why this song? Well, some years ago in the Zeki Müren Museum in Bodrum, I saw a picture of the program of one of his early nightclub appearances, and at the very end, the final song that he sang was Saadettin Kaynak's fantasy song, Menekşe Sular, roughly the mid-1950s, I think we're talking about here. The song, of course, is a much older song. But this song, at least then, was an important song for Zeki Müren. Somehow it stood for his voice at that particular time. Before I go any further, how's my voice? I just want to see some nodding heads. I'll carry on speaking in this way as long as this is comprehensible and clear. Okay, good. So Menekşe Sular is of course a song that has rather been forgotten these days, but evidently for Zeki Müren, at one point at least, 1950s, 1960s, it seems to have been an important song. It says something about him, it would seem. So he noted on the margins of this program in the museum, I always used to close my acts, my nightclub acts, with this song. I don't know whether it's true or not, but clearly it was important to him. Is this a song? How many people know this song apart from Shahfor? And a handful of people know it. I was going to play it, and then I couldn't get my recording sorted out, and then I thought I'll sing it, and then I thought, no, I can't possibly do that. So I won't do that, but I'll just, I want to remind you about this song, because this is a very good example of how a song might be considered to speak in performance with many different voices. Menekşe sular, sular, menekşe Menekşe sular. Okay, that's how it starts. Is the first section, and then there's a chorus. Dikensiz gül olmazmış. That's the chorus, which you might remember. And then there's a kind of maya, gazel, ne bülbül gülü sevdi seni sevdiğim kadar, which I won't attempt to sing because that's very difficult indeed. Listen to that song carefully, and I think that there are three quite different voices here. First of all, a voice which is a descriptive voice, which is describing an amorous situation. The lover alone is thinking about his beloved who is not there. So a poetic description of the situation of the lover without his beloved. A second voice associated with the chorus. Dikensiz gül olmazmış. Now this is a voice of resolution. Okay? So the lover is telling himself, be strong. Love is always hard, it's always tough, it's always going to hurt. You're not the only one. Man up and deal with it. Okay? There's voice 3, which then backtracks on that immediately. Ne bülbül gülü sevdi seni sevdiğim kadar. In which love has become not manageable, but excessive. Okay, the singer is overwhelmed by the magnitude of his love and the magnitude of the pain that he feels. And this third voice, a voice of kind of capitulation to fantasy and the excessiveness of love, you might divide it into two parts. So at the end of this, içli bir özleyişle bırak beni yanayım. Gözlerinde gördüğüm rüyama inanayım. Excuse my pronunciation there. Is if this is what love is going to be, if love is going to hurt me so much, I don't want it. I would prefer fantasy. Okay? I would prefer a manageable fantasy. So within that third voice there, I think you could divide that third voice, if you're really thinking this through, into at least two parts. Fantasy, the musical genre, fantasy, the genre associated with people like Saadettin Kaynak, lends itself to this kind of perspectival performance of emotion. A perspectival performance of emotion. The emotions aren't simply pouring out of one individual. The emotional situation is being described from different imaginary positions. Now, it's this perspectival and reflexive performance of emotion that one might appropriately describe as melodramatic, or perhaps even sentimental, in a rather 18th century sense of the word. For Adam Smith, sentimentality was always about perspective. The sentimental situation is one in which people are looking at an emotional situation from different perspectives and having a kind of conversation about it. So I think in this rather interesting sense, we might talk about a melodramatic voice or a sentimental voice, which is internally split. Within this one voice, there are many voices. Within this one voice, there are multiple voices which are not happily coexisting. They are in conflict with one another. Okay. So the point that I want to make here, the point that I want to underline here, is that Zeki Müren's, the question of which voice have we lost is an extremely complicated one. There are many voices which have been lost. What interests me as an ethnomusicologist are the ways in which Zeki Müren's voice has, both during his own lifetime and in the years following his death, the way in which Zeki Müren's voice has been construed as, or constructed as, a unitary object, as a single thing, as an identifiable voice. I stress the word identifiable here, as a voice which possesses qualities of singularity. Okay, so we know that Zeki Müren's voice is multiple. There's lots of different Zeki Müren's, lots of different Zeki Müren voices. But in the discussion in Turkey about Zeki Müren's voice, what's happening is a singular voice is being constructed, an identifiable voice is being constructed. Now, the work and the labor that has gone into that process of construction is quite interesting to me, because, I mean, voices are very, very complicated things. We have to do something to be able to unify them and identify them as a singular voice, to say that's Frank Sinatra's voice, or that's Zeki Müren's voice, or that's Abdul Halim Hafiz's voice. Okay? Some work is taking place to actually construe this voice as a singular object. A very interesting contributor to this process was Edip Özışık. Edip Özışık's, correct me if I'm wrong, Şehfar, Edip Özışık's brother was a composer who Zeki Müren championed, who he sang a lot of his music. So Edip Özışık, in this book, Musiki Sanatı, which is not just about Zeki Müren, but it's certainly mainly about Zeki Müren, is a kind of repaying the favor to Zeki Müren, to sort of congratulate him on his voice as a way of repaying a debt to his brother. So it's a very interesting book to get hold of and thinking about Zeki Müren's voice. Zeki Müren's voice, according to Edip Özışık, had many different qualities which he separated into internal qualities and external qualities. But what interests me about this book and Edip Özışık's analysis of Zeki Müren's voice is that it's not completely complimentary. He's not just saying, this is an amazing voice, we all think you're fantastic. He's not just saying that at all. It's actually quite critical. He's saying this is a different kind of voice. It's not an obvious voice. It's not a voice that we've heard before. It has qualities of newness that we need to get our heads around. It's not a voice that we can just approach in the same way that we approach the voices of the classical past. It has qualities of newness that we have to try and understand. He described it. I mean, another thing that's interesting is that for Öz Işık, Zeki Müren's voice was it wasn't an obvious voice. He was no Caruso, he said. He's no Caruso. Everyone listens to Caruso, Ernesto Caruso, and it's clear that this is a fantastic singer, the best singer in the world. Zeki Müren's voice is not like that at all. Interestingly, he described Zeki Müren's voice as microphonic. This was a microphonic voice, an expression that we would now use to connect with the cyborg properties of this voice, which is to say the kind of mechanical properties of this voice connected to a microphone, shaped around a microphone, a semi-mechanical voice. Okay. So the cyborg qualities of the voice seem to be touched on here by Öz Işık. And a circulatory voice. So when I speak into a microphone, I'm not just speaking to you here, but my voice recorded perhaps goes off in all sorts of different directions and gets heard in all sorts of other places. So mikrofonik bir ses, a microphonic voice, is something that, extrapolating from Öz Işık, we might say has both cyborg properties, kind of connecting the vocal organism with this technology, and circulatory properties, which is to say connecting this voice with something that circulates outside of its particular space. Now this is all it constitutes a very interesting analysis of a voice and an effort to imagine it as being something which possesses a certain kind of integrity and a certain kind of identifiability. This is the beginning, to my mind, of a rather long process in which people start to build up a picture of the identifiability of the Zeki Müren voice as a kind of singular object. Stressing, interestingly for me, at least, and I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are about this, qualities of uyum, okay, a certain kind of authentic, what's the word I'm looking for? Regularity, integrity of a certain kind. Integrity is probably a good English translation for that. So whatever he was singing, whether he was singing arabesque or whether he was singing film music in the 1950s, there was always this quality of identifiable quality of kind of authenticity, seriousness, and so on and so forth. A quality of nezaket. Okay. What is involved in everything that hinges on that word in Turkish, with a certain kind of delicacy, a certain kind of concern, a certain kind of emotional reserve, as it were, in the spirit of fitting in, conforming, working with other people. And of course, a quality of emotion that Öz Işık is particularly interested in here, duygusallık. Much of this, as I've discussed in another publication, revolves around the question of his relationship to the Turkish language, in particular, diction. Okay, shall I continue for another 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Are you happy with that? Yeah. When you want me to stop, just go like that, and then we can open it up for questions. So, just to summarize where I am at the moment, what interests me in this case, as in others, is how a very plural voice comes to be thought of as a singular voice, as an identifiable voice, as the voice of an individual, through complex social labors. We now, moving towards a conclusion here, we now, today, identify this voice with various social and political projects. And these, in turn, point to the key anxieties of our times and where we feel them to lie. how we think about Zeki Müren's voice now points us in the direction of what it is that we feel that we have lost in losing Zeki Müren. And what it is, and I think that there are all sorts of different potential answers to this, but I think that the key term here is civility, to which one might attach the question of citizenship. So what I'm talking about here is how we come to, through certain kinds of social and political labours, identify this lost voice with things that we feel are desperately lacking or missing in our own social environment. And I think that when Zeki Müren died in 1996, I think that this was a key moment of transformation of the Turkish public sphere, as you, of course, know much better than I. And I think as part of that transformation, I think one of the big topics of anxiety and concern has been the question of civility and of citizenship, what citizenship actually now means in the kind of republic that you are now living in. Post-Susurluk, okay, it was roughly contemporaneous with the Susurluk incidents, which sparked, of course, massive cynicism with power and government. 1996, of course, was at the beginning of the AK Party rise to power. It was the beginning of the formation of the contemporary neoliberal state. So Turkey is, I believe, a country that feels considerable anxieties about the question of citizenship, what it once meant, where the stresses and pressures on it now lie, and what it might yet be. Zeki Müren has become, I would argue, a sign of citizenship and citizenship anxieties. And I want to leave you with two pieces of evidence for that, apart from my own kind of surmise here. One is that Emine Ashan's very interesting biography of Zeki Müren. It's a kind of biography written for fans, of course, but I think it said a lot of very interesting things. Was subtitled Zeki Müren, the model citizen, Zeki Müren, Örnek Yurttaştı, or that was the subtitle of the book, as I recall. So very soon after his death, you already have the beginning of a kind of citizenship narrative building up. And what might have been meant by that was something that interested me greatly when I was writing Aşk Cumhuriyeti. A second point that I would make in complete conclusion here is to think about not just popular literature, but maybe some areas of more progressive art and installation work. And I have in mind a piece that maybe everybody here knows, which is Erinç Seymen's Bir Paşa'nın Portresi of 2009, which has been subject to a very interesting analysis by Cüneyt Çakırlar and Serkan Delice, two good friends of mine, published a little while back. This revolves around the mythical story of Zeki Müren's meeting with Kenan Evren, in which the Pasha, Kenan Evren, summons him and says, okay, I don't get, they call you Pasha, but they don't call me Pasha, so what's going on here? And Zeki Müren, in a difficult situation, thinks for a while, as well he might, and then he says, apparently, so the story goes, well, they call me Pasha because the people feel that they can listen to me. At least, so the story goes. So Bir Paşa'nın Portresi is an evocation of that conversation. It's an installation piece in which a man with a gun, who you can see at the bottom of the screen there, is shooting at a screen. There's a screen print of Zeki Müren's face, and so he's shooting through that to make an image of bullets, of bullet holes on a piece of paper behind, which you can see on the top of the screen there. So it's a very witty and subtle play on the ideas of sentimentality and violence, a very witty and subtle play on the legacy of the junta years. It's a very subtle and witty play on the idea about power and the relationship between military power and, as it were, cultural power. So there's also, it's a piece, Erinç Seymen's work is a piece that sets in play all sorts of rather interesting questions here. I would add to Çakırlar and Delice's interpretation here, which is one that is really working through certain questions about queer theory here, and it's very much about Erinç Seymen and not about Zeki Müren, I would have to say. I think where I'm coming from would add to this kind of interpretation a nostalgic preoccupation with questions about civility and citizenship. So it's a way, I think, of approaching the nostalgic and memorial and artistic legacy of Zeki Müren from a quite interesting perspective. At least that would be my argument, and the one that I'd put to you now. Thank you very much for listening to me. I really appreciate once again the invitation. I hope we can have some conversation, but please do ask any questions or put any thoughts that you have in Turkish, and I'd be grateful for that. But thank you very much. Yes. Yeah.
First was answer was of course voice.
Yeah.
But immediately after the voice, the image.
The image.
So, what do you think about this image side of Zeki Müren, because it is strongly connected to the voice of Zeki Müren?
Well, I think your observation raises an interesting psychoanalytic truism, which is when you think you've lost something, you start finding it everywhere, right? So what struck me after 1996 was that Zeki Müren imagery started to appear everywhere. You open a newspaper, there's Zeki Müren. You click on a website, there's Zeki Müren. I mean, the imagery actually proliferated, I think, in many ways after he died. I think you have to remember, or at least my recollection, is that Zeki Müren, from roughly the mid-1980s through to the time of his death, had more or less disappeared from the Turkish public sphere. You'd very rarely see him in the newspapers. You'd very rarely see him on television. He was ill. He had retired to Bodrum. He'd kind of disappeared in a funny kind of a way. So with 1996 and with his death, what I remember at least is that the imagery started to proliferate and increase. I mean, his death was productive of the imagery. In a way, I would say, far from losing the image, I think his death actually was very productive of Zeki Müren imagery in a funny kind of way. I mean, that would be a way I would play with your interesting question there. Of course, I mean, the other interesting thing that happens with digitization is the kind of more radical separation of the voice and the vocal memory, and the memory of the vocal tradition, and the visual memories, the iconographic imagination, and the iconographic memory. And I think another thing that I find quite interesting here is how as it were, the kind of voice-oriented ways of remembering Zeki Müren, ways kind of treasured by musicians perhaps, and the more imagistic way of remembering Zeki Müren, they're kind of parted company in a rather interesting and curious way. So certainly an image has been lost, but, well, this is what the psychoanalysts tell us. I mean, when we've lost something, we find ways in the search for it to kind of reproduce and proliferate that very imagery.
Is it also true for the voice?
Yes. Yes. I think so. A little less so, because the voice is owned in a slightly different way, right? So you can reproduce Zeki Müren's voice, but at the final analysis, somebody owns that reproduction and can control its circulation, whereas that's much less true of a lot of imagery, which is just newspaper imagery in the public domain. I think it is true of the voice, but I think it circulates in a slightly different way. Yeah, it certainly is true of the voice. Of course it is. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, for example, I consider myself, not a deep scholar of Zeki Müren at all, a rather casual scholar. I mean, Zeki Müren for me, for 10 years, was the Zeki Müren of Kahır Mektubu onwards. It was the arabesque Zeki Müren. And really, I had very little idea of the Zeki Müren of the 1950s, which I discovered much later in the 1990s as a result of those Kalan recordings. And I was very ignorant of the voices in the Zeki Müren voice of the films, of Beklenen Şarkı and Son Beste, and those films that we were hearing about this morning. These were things that I discovered much later. So I think that underlines your point here that with a death and with a nostalgia cult comes a search and a quest which produces exactly what it is that we think has been lost. Nice question. I'm very happy for this, for anybody who would like a sort of to switch to Turkish or to
Ben Türkçe soracağım Martin.
tabii. And translate, or we'll figure out a way of doing it, I'm sure.
İngilizce içerim olmadı.
Tabii.
Bu dedin ya, Zeki Müren'de birçok ses var. Yani plural bir ses var. Birçok farklı sentimental yerden bakıyor. Sence bu ses radyoya ilk başladığı günden beri var mıydı? Yoksa sonra mı geliştirdi? Çünkü bunu şunun için soruyorum. Zeki Müren dinleyenlerde yani benim kendi etrafımda gözlemlediğim iki farklı tip dinleyici var. Bir, Zeki Müren'in radyo kayıtlarına çok böyle müptelası olanlar diyelim. Onlar Zeki Müren'i şunun için dinliyorlar. Ben de kendim o kategoride olduğum için hani onlar adına konuşmuş gibi olayım. Ben orada aslında Zeki Müren'i değil, güzel bir icrayı dinliyorum. Yani o kadar güzel bir eseri çok güzel ifade ettiği için. Ama sonrasından dinleyenler biraz daha Zeki Müren'in kendisini dinliyor gibi bir izlenim ediniyorum. Yani Zeki Müren'in sesini. Yani Zeki Müren ne okusa, ya bu şuna benziyor. Bir romanı hikayesi okumak vardır. Bir de dili için okumak vardır. Mesela Peyami Safa ben ne yazsa okurum. Benim hayatım yazsa da okurum. Yani her şeyi okurum. Sesini beğeniyorum. Onun benim kulağımda bıraktığı tınıyı seviyorum. Zeki Müren'de de acaba böyle bir şey var mı? Yani ilk baştaki radyodaki kayıtları acaba güzel bir icrayken daha sonra o senin bahsettiğin plural sesler acaba sonradan mı eklendi de bu kadar büyük bir isim haline geldi acaba?
I think I'm remembering Şefor Hoca's observation at the end of the last session that we have to keep reminding ourselves that Zeki Müren, first of all was a radio artist, and that he was responsible to that world, and he had to, create a kind of artistic personality for himself within that world, and had to observe that world's protocols and the conservatism of that world, and what that world was at that particular moment. So I think that what you're saying is right. So the people here will know better than I, but there was a period of time where he was basically a radio artist, and it was only later in the 1950s that he became the nightclub artist and then associated with films. And that kind of star complex you're talking about happened later in that decade. So I think it's not only interesting, I think it's quite important to remember that it's not that was the case, that there was radio Zeki Müren, and then there was nightclubs. Then there was nightclub Zeki Müren and film star Zeki Müren, which changed the pattern of how he was listened to. I think the way you're describing it is exactly right. I think it's important to remember that, and it's important, and I think that also reminds us that people listen to Zeki Müren in lots of different ways, right? I think it's not just that there were lots of different Zeki Mürens, there were lots of different Zeki Müren audiences as well. I think that's right. Yeah. Thanks. I'm happy if you want to translate my attempt at an answer back into Turkish for people who'd like that, but whatever. I'm sure we're fine. Ali Murat.
Hi, Martin. thank you for this wonderful, fantastic speech that I have always admired your work and I have been following you all over the years since our days in Oxford. And it was very good indeed. But I was wondering that you just touched upon the last thing in your speech about transgender, queer theory, and whether you could say something about whether Zeki Müren paved the way for the latecomers like Bülent Ersoy and etc. Despite the fact that he was a normal person in public life, but in his private life he was a queer person, and then he did something perhaps from looking from the outside, something unacceptable in Turkish society. I mean, culturally and religiously, conservatively, etc. But he was accepted by the Turkish society because he was a Paşa, as you said. But later, Bülent Ersoy, like Zeki Müren, both of them met Kenan Evren after the military coup. And Bülent Ersoy was imprisoned because of his action in İzmir Fuarı. I think that he wanted to prove that he was a woman or something at that time. I don't remember very well. And Zeki Müren, was he really a person, a voice that only addressed to people who like classical music, or also he, in, as you said, plurality, that he addressed to other people as well? And if we take all of them in a neoliberal society, or in a society that has been liberated or changing and transforming Turkish society, what could you say on that?
There's two observations there that I'd want to respond to. Thank you for the question. And so the first one had to do with the queer and transgender issues. I used to feel kind of confident about my ideas on this subject, and now I don't at all. Actually, I find the more I think about this situation, the more complicated it gets. Because of course, debates and discussions about transgender issues are now, certainly in England at the moment, are moving so fast and they're so complicated. I feel less and less confident talking about this, and of course, many people here will know a lot more about this than me. We had some interesting and very interesting panel this morning, in which one thing that came up and that Mustafa Avcı talked about very interestingly was the way of thinking of the Zeki Müren tradition as having some continuity with the Ottoman Zenne and Sakilik tradition, and I think that's that kind of longue durée sort of historical relationship of mainstream Ottoman and Turkish culture with figures of gender ambiguity and queerness is, I think, important, actually. And it's a useful way of reminding us that it's quite a continual tradition. And it's one that has, worked its way right up, via Tarkan, right up into the present day. So I think it's always useful to think about the longer-term cultural patterns here. And I think that's the way I would prefer to look at it, rather than thinking of Zeki Müren as somebody who, as you put it, paved the way for people who came after. Because, of course, Bülent Ersoy performed his sort of transgender identity in a very different kind of a way, a much more aggressive and overt and sort of troubling kind of way, at least as far as mainstream culture is concerned. It's a tricky question. I know we're going to hear more about it as the day goes on. And at the end, you said, and then there's another very interesting observation there about how Zeki Müren, it's Zeki Müren is not just, as it were, the classical singer, not just the singer of a particular genre, but somebody who can, as it were, do everything, who can, as it were, sing everything. And I suppose going right back to the 1950s and the radio personality, Zeki Müren, he was singing his version, the classicized version of the folk music, the classical music, the early Ottoman tradition, deep music history. So right from the very beginning, he was all about performing a certain kind of virtuosity that involved being able to sing everything. And this kind of went on, I think, throughout his career. Now this is, I think, is interesting about these kinds of figures, and by these kinds of figures I mean the Amalia Rodriguez, Abdul Halim Hafiz, Kulthum, you know, these kind of singers who somehow who come after their death to stand for the nation, to stand for some kind of totality here. And an important thing when one looks at their careers is to think about how they performed their ability to sing everything. You know, they weren't just singers of a particular genre and a particular niche. There was a kind of diva-like performance of I can do everything, and that was Zeki Müren. You know, that was the Paşa position, I suppose you could say. Thanks. Yeah, two very interesting observations. I like that.
Also, could we say that something moving from cultural intimacy to social intimacy with Zeki Müren and all these similar performance?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, the work of cultural intimacy and social intimacy is work that is being done after his death by the communities, indeed, such as us, who kind of come together to figure out what this voice is, what this means for us as a society, what this means for us as a community, how this might help us to think about the interesting and complicated things that are going on in our society. I mean, I think that that's the cultural intimacy dimension of this, which I think is very important. Thanks. Ara verelim, oldu. Dinlediğiniz için teşekkür ederim. Şeref verdiniz, sağ olun.